Hi, welcome back. This is the last video for this week, the first section on Middle English. Here in our title page is the poster child for Middle English literature, Geoffrey Chaucer himself, riding a horse, pointing at his book. This is a copy of the Canterbury Tales. I think it's the famous Ellesmere manuscript, one of the most famous deluxe manuscripts. You can make it out where it says, "Here be Ginneth Chaucer's something, something, something." All right, so let's talk about Middle English. We're going to talk about morphology, which is just word endings, verb conjugations, adjectives, nouns, stuff like that. A lot happens in the Middle English period. One thing to talk about that's interesting is, Britannic, which was spoken in what is now England in the early Middle Ages, was basically driven entirely out of England by speakers of Germanic, by speakers of English. And English English speakers were then conquered by French speakers. So why is it that English continued to survive? The two major factors about Middle English that are the most important, perhaps, are that it survived. We still speak English. Also, it changed rapidly. So I want to talk just briefly, and this really isn't in Van Gelderen, the textbook, but why did English survive? Well, for one thing, it continued to be the spoken language of the common people. Monastic scribes kept standard Old English, West Saxon alive. And later on, there would be poetry written in the alliterative verse style that Old English poets had been using. This is referred to as the alliterative revival, and this starts in the 1300s in connection perhaps to the emergent sense of Englishness that happens in the war with France, the 100 Years' War that we spoke about in the last video. Also, the bonds between Normans in England, the French speakers who came over, and the French speakers back in France weakened over time for political, social, and cultural factors. The kind of French that was spoken in English in England, Anglo-Norman, came to lose its prestige relative to the French of France, and particularly of the part of central France where Paris is, known as the Ile-de-France. And so, in fact, in the late Middle Ages, rich English people and nobility would send their children to France to get tutored there or get French tutors so that they could speak French with a Parisian accent, not with the hick kind of Anglo-Norman accent that had lost all its cachet. So as Anglo-Norman lost its prestige, it was less of a competitor for English. Also, and this is probably one of the most crucial factors, when the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes came into England, they kept coming and coming and coming and coming until their population was equivalent or greater to that of the Celtic speakers who were already there. A limited number of French speakers come over to England after the Norman conquest. 5% of the total population of England. How did the Normans pull this off? Well, military technology, heavy cavalry, castles, but that's for another course. Probably a more fun one than this one, but who knows? But yeah, so it's kind of amazing though that with only 5% of the population, so much French gets into the English language. But that is the power of prestige. That is the power of being the people at the top, who have to be accommodated and who have to be served and who get to write the laws and the books and everything. As we already mentioned, there was a revival of English during the 100 Years' War, culminating in the language policies of Henry V, which involved laws being written down in English as well, rather than French in Parliament. But there's some other interesting things to talk about, which I'm going to leave aside for now. So yeah, English survives, but it changes rapidly. The English changes far more quickly during the Middle English period than it will after or than it had before. This is for several reasons. One, without an elite, an English-speaking elite traveling between regions. There's no elite standard that emerges around a court or a central place of learning. This means that regional divergences have far more reaching changes. There's a sense in which English speakers in each part of England are more isolated from one another. There's no prestige variety to enforce standards and slow down change. We'll talk more about this. We're getting into sociolinguistics now. We will talk more about this in the coming weeks. But nobody corrects Middle English as it's spoken, especially in the early Middle English period, because who bothers to correct what is considered a substandard peasant speech anyway? There is also an influx of French words that puts pressure on the lexical system, the vocabulary, the lexical fields, the discourse domains. And some of the reasons for cause or effect, but inflections, the endings that change the function of a speech, of a word, whether it's a direct object or a noun or the tense of a verb, these get reduced and simplified. We are moving the slider now from synthetic back to analytic, where grammatical relationships of a sentence are going to be mainly indicated by prepositions and a fixed word order rather than case endings on nouns. And for this reason, many to most grammatical endings disappear. There's a lot of change that happens. Let's talk about a few of them as they connect to the morphology of the English language. First, pronouns. She replaced HEL because HEL was the female pronoun and he was the masculine pronoun, and you can see why having those more distinct would have been useful to people back then, especially in a society that was so heavily gendered. Here's another one. You and ye become formal as well as plural. In Old English, do is the informal, do is singular, and you, or thu is singular, and you is plural. And the, that's the accusative form, the is plural, is singular, and ye is plural. But in Old English, by analogy to the French tu and vous, where you have like a familiar versus a formal way of saying you, which is a situation that prevails in a lot of European languages, Spanish, German, French, Portuguese, Italian. This also comes to be the case in English as well. We also get the gradual replacement of the third person plural pronouns he for they and hem for them with they and them. Now, as I said a few videos ago, they and them originally came from Old Norse. And if you look at the manuscript record and the written records, what you will find is that they and them sort of moves down from the north, where there was the most influence on Old Norse. In the north of England, it sort of moves from the northeast through the southwest until finally, by the late Middle English period, they, them has entirely replaced he, hem. You also get in pronouns a loss of the distinction between dative and accusative. So you would have had the pronoun system like thu for the subject, vin for the genitive, thek for the dative. I give it to you. I give thek, right? Would be to you. And then the for the accusative, or vina. And basically those get squashed together into a single object case in the pronouns. And the pronouns will be the only part of the language that keeps case. You get a complete disappearance of the dual pronoun, the pronoun that refers to when you just have two. And the demonstrative that becomes a relative pronoun. It gets sort of transported and borrowed and what's called grammaticalized as a subordinating conjunction. I know that you are smart. All of this amounts to varying degrees of inflectional decay. This is a key term here. Inflectional decay means loss of inflectional endings. Let's talk about some of the inflectional decay in verbs and adverbs. Many strong conjugation verbs become weak, and they are consolidated into a fewer classes. What does it mean for a strong verb to become weak? Well, in Middle English, I walk to the store, but yesterday I welk to the store, right? becomes I walk. Yesterday I walked. Now, here in the Ozarks, we have, especially with old timers, you can hear a few survivals of some archaic forms of strong verbs in English. One of my favorite examples is clomb. For climb, I climbed the tree, I climbed the tree, no, I clomb the tree. But generally speaking, as in other regions of the English speaking world, the distinctions between regions are growing less and less. So you're not going to find young people who say, I clomb the tree. You will still hear people say, I drug it instead of I dragged it, which is, it can be a little alarming sometimes, is when somebody said I drug my child. And what? No, I dragged my child is what they meant. That's a case where a strong verb has survived and not been lost. Greetings from the Ozarks. We did lose in the Middle English period a distinct participle ending, the anda or enda, which survives for a much longer time in the north and west of England. So, for example, the walking man in Middle English would be the Wakanda man. Not Wakanda forever. Walkanda, right, would be a walking person, or a slependa would be a sleeping person, right? As opposed to the gerund, which would have been walking or sleeping. And a gerund, of course, refers to a noun that names the act of the verb, not an adjective that puts the action of the verb onto a noun. In modern English, the gerund and the participle uses the same form. We also get during the Middle English period a gradual loss of this Germanic ge or ge prefix in participles, which survives in German. Eriton, it means written. I have written. Ich habe geritan will just become ritan and then just written. And also, this is a fun one, marginally connected. In Old English, you have an adverbial suffix, leech, which means like. So quickly would have been quickleach, which would have been quick like, which is kind of like a southern thing. I did it real quick like. But that's actually a revival or a survival of a very old form of adverb formation. That leak becomes lee. It gets shortened. It loses the consonant at the end. Let's talk more about the decay of inflectional endings. This time, let's talk about nouns. We don't have cases for nouns anymore, except for the genitive has survived as the possessive. So in Old English, we'll have muth, muthus, mutha, muth to go through the nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative. But in London Standard Middle English of the kind that Chaucer will write, we have mutha, muthus, mutha, mutha. You can see that there's only two forms, and the only one that's distinct is the form that's used for the possessive. We also get a gradual replacement of a plural with e made out of en, as in children or oxen or brethren, with s. For most words, the ones that I just listed you are a few very exceptional survivals of plurals that end in the en suffix. Not even that long ago, plural of eyes, as in eyes, would have been eyen. That would have been in the 1600s, people were still saying that. But almost all forms of words that took the en plural have been replaced by s. So that's a further decay of classes of inflectional endings. We get a loss of singular and plural distinctions in adjectives. In English, we do not have adjectives agree with nouns in case, gender, and number like in other languages. This is why you don't say attorney generals, you say attorneys general, because the general is actually an adjective, which, because we're borrowing a French phrase, the general is after the noun. It's noun. Attorney is the noun, general is the adjective, and so you pluralize in English the noun, not the adjective. Attorneys general, Whoppers Jr. Okay, the demonstrative adjective, we have 16 different forms. Visa, vaza, vam, fa, fa. Collapse into this and that. Those are the two that remain from, it's like Survivor. All the other ones get voted off the island. And here's the kicker. Here's the big thing that's really distinctive about English relative to most other Indo-European languages, as far as I know, and all other Germanic languages, is the complete loss of grammatical gender. English speakers, they enroll in a class in German or Spanish or French or Russian, and suddenly they're like, wait a second, a table is feminine, but a hand is neuter, but a head is feminine, but a foot is masculine. What is even going on? This is crazy. This is because we've lost grammatical gender in nouns. Perhaps this is because of the simplification of our demonstratives and our adjectives. Perhaps it's because of English's contact with French, but also Old Norse. There's evidence that we were already losing grammatical gender even before the Norman conquest. And one theory about how this happened is that you get Old English speakers and Old Norse speakers kind of next to each other who speak a language that's pretty alike. Like they can kind of make out what each other are saying, but there are differences in inflectional endings. There's differences in how gender is expressed in grammatically. There are differences in case endings. But if the stem is roughly the same and the endings are different, well, then they're going to speak a kind of mishmash to each other, where they just drop those endings that confuse each other. This is a process that is referred to as creolization, which we will talk more about later. But so this is one theory as to how English loses its case system and its gender system, that it had more to do with the contact with Old Norse and the number of Old Norse speakers that settled in the Danelaw in England. This video is getting really long, but I promise you we're done. That's it. Thank you for listening to this long and technical and dense video on morphology of Middle English. I hope it's been helpful to you. This one I might go in and put in those parts like you get in some videos, like blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's it. This unit of Middle English Part 1. Next week we will talk about syntax and some other stuff too. All right. Thank you for joining me. Bye.